A thin cry pierced the cold March air, slicing through the ruins of a German town as if the war itself had found a new voice, smaller, weaker, but somehow sharper than gunfire. It carried across the broken stone and shattered timber, echoing off the hollow shells of houses that once held families, laughter, and the ordinary rhythm of life. Now only the wind and that single fragile wail moved through the wreckage, as though the world were holding its breath. For the American nurses advancing with a small medical detachment, that sound stopped them in their tracks more effectively than any rifle shot. They knew the cry of a wounded man, the groan of a dying soldier, even the murmur of civilians who no longer had the strength to shout. But this was different. This was the unmistakable, desperate shriek of an infant who had gone far too long without comfort. Lieutenant and Whitaker, 26 years old and carrying more months of fatigue than she could count, stepped forward first. Her boots cracked over the frost as she adjusted the strap of her medical bag. "It's close," she murmured, her voice barely audible beneath the distant rumble of artillery far beyond the town's edge. War wasn't over, not yet. But here inside this destroyed street, peace had settled in a strange, almost sacred stillness, broken only by that single cry. The detachment moved slowly, rifles half raised, eyes scanning doorways and shadows. But the nurse's attention was fixed on a collapsed stone house just ahead. Its upper floor had pancaked down into the lower rooms, creating narrow cavities of darkness broken by streaks of pale morning light. From somewhere inside, the tiny cry wavered again, weak, trembling, but insistent, and exchanged a glance with the nearest medic, Corporal Lewis, who nodded and gestured the soldiers into a protective spread. "We clear it," he said quietly, "and then you go in." They all knew civilians often hid in ruins like these, afraid of soldiers, afraid of being mistaken for combatants, afraid of everything the last years had made possible. But fear didn't matter here. That sound demanded human response, not hesitation, and crouched low and climbed through a fractured doorway. Dust swirled in the cold air as she pushed aside a partially burned wooden beam. Inside, the smell hit her first, a mix of damp earth, lingering smoke, and the stale scent of unwashed fabric. It was the smell of people who had been trapped too long with too little. As her eyes adjusted, she saw a young woman huddled against a wall that was barely standing. Her clothes, once a simple wool dress and coat, were torn and coated in ash. Her face, framed by uncombed blonde hair, bore the unmistakable hollows of starvation. She couldn't have been older than her early 20s. In her trembling arms, she held a baby wrapped in a threadbare blanket. The child's face was red from crying, cheeks sunken, eyes squeezed shut as if the effort of staying alive had become too heavy. The young woman looked up at him with wide, exhausted eyes, blue, glassy, and terrified. She tried to speak, but could only manage a hoarse whisper before breaking into a cough that sounded painful and dry, and approached slowly, hands raised to show she meant no harm. "I'm a nurse," she said gently, one of the German phrases she and other medics had practiced out of necessity. The mother flinched, instinctively pulling the infant closer, but her arms shook so violently that she nearly dropped him, and moved forward without waiting for permission and steadied the baby with careful hands. The mother didn't resist this time. She simply stared, defeated, as though hope had run out days ago. Outside, the other nurses and medics crowded around the opening, watching with tense anticipation. Inside, and loosened the blanket around the infant. His skin was cool, his breathing shallow. The small, desperate cry tapered into a soft whimper as he nuzzled weakly toward her gloved fingers. His throat tightened. The mother finally managed to speak through chapped lips. "I have no milk left." Her voice cracked, almost breaking on the last word. She looked down at the baby with a guilt that pierced deeper than hunger. "Nothing," she whispered as tears slid silently down her cheeks, leaving thin paths through the grime, and had seen starvation in field hospitals, seen mothers too weak to stand and infants too exhausted to cry. But seeing it here, in this ruined shell of a home, in a woman the enemy had taught Americans to fear, struck her with a force she wasn't prepared for. The war had drawn lines on maps and in minds, but hunger never cared about uniforms, borders, or propaganda. Hunger simply consumed. She glanced back toward the doorway and called softly, "Maria, bring the kit." Another nurse, Maria Jensen, slipped inside with a small pouch containing powdered milk rations and a collapsible cup, and knelt in the debris beside the mother. "We can help," she said quietly, unsure if the woman understood the words, but hoping she felt the intent. The young mother opened her mouth, perhaps to refuse, perhaps to apologize, but no words came. She simply nodded, a tiny, fragile movement that carried the weight of surrender and trust at the same time. Maria set up a small heating unit just outside the door, boiling a bit of water in a metal cup as in check the infant for fever, infection, dehydration. The baby was dangerously undernourished, but still fighting, and could feel it in his small, trembling breaths. As the formula warmed, the mother watched every movement with desperate eyes. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered finally, and didn't answer immediately. Behind her, the American soldiers stood guard, their silhouettes filling the fractured doorway. The scene held an impossible contrast. Uniforms, rifles, helmets, all framing the image of a starving mother and her child. Perhaps that contrast was answer enough. Button still spoke, softly, without looking up. "Because your baby needs to live." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. The water finished heating. Maria poured it into the cup, mixed the powdered milk, stirred it until it thickened. The first thin trail of steam rose, twisting upward through the broken roof as though carrying some small prayer, and took the cup in both hands, testing the temperature, ensuring it wouldn't burn the infant. The baby whimpered again, barely mustering the strength, as she brought the cup closer. "Come on, little one," she murmured. Outside, the wind paused. Even the rubble seemed to hold still. And just as the cup reached the child's lips, a sound crackled over the medic's radio behind them. Urgent, sharp, and unmistakably close. A new threat approaching. The nurses froze. The mother stiffened. The soldiers snapped to attention. Whatever was coming next would decide far more than one infant's fate. The infant's cry still lingered in Anne's ears long after the radio crackle faded. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a reminder of something far larger than one ruined home. It was the voice of a nation that had been starved long before the battles reached its streets. As the soldiers fanned out to investigate the nearby disturbance and stayed close to the mother and child, her mind racing through what she knew, not from reports or lectures, but from months of walking into towns just like this one. Germany was collapsing not only militarily, but physically, nutritionally, biologically. People were not only losing battles, they were losing their bodies. And nowhere was that collapse more visible than in mothers like this young woman, whose strength had been drained with a quiet brutality no bullet could match. Food scarcity had begun years earlier, but by the winter of 1944 to 45, it became catastrophic. Allied bombings shattered rail lines. Farm output dropped to a fraction of what it had been, and whatever remained rarely reached civilian kitchens, and had seen ration cards that promised 2,000 calories a day, yet people were surviving, barely, on half that. A mother nursing a child needed more than bread crusts and watery soup, yet that was all many had. The body responded predictably. It stopped producing milk, not from lack of love or willingness, but from simple starvation. The war that raged in factories and fields had found its way into human cells, shutting down life from the inside. Maria knew all of this too. In training, they studied disease, infection, battlefield trauma. But in the field, they learned a different syllabus, one written in sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, and the quiet dignity of civilians too exhausted to beg. Maria crouched beside the young mother now, her gaze lingering on the woman's hands. They were trembling from malnutrition, but still curved protectively around the baby, as if instinct alone gave her strength. "She hasn't eaten properly in days," Maria murmured. "Maybe weeks." The mother understood pieces of their hushed conversation. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, though it did little to hide her frailty. Her stomach was painfully flat against her ribs. Her legs, when she tried to adjust her posture, nearly buckled under her. She was not an enemy. She was not a threat. She was simply one of millions of German civilians caught in a machine too large to fight and too merciless to escape. Outside the ruined doorway, the streets reflected the same story. I could see it every time the wind stirred the curtains of dust. The remains of barns that once held cattle, now empty. Broken carts that had once delivered milk, now overturned. The silent, abandoned wells where mothers once fetched water for their families. War had not only taken sons and husbands. It had taken cows, grain, fields, and futures. And in doing so, it had taken milk. When the baby whimpered again, the mother instinctively offered her breast, not out of hope, but habit. The child tried to latch, but quickly pulled away, frustrated, starving, confused. The mother flinched with shame, turning her face as if the failure were hers alone, not the war's, and gently touched her shoulder. "It's not your fault," she said softly. The woman met her eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or a brief dismantling of the invisible wall that uniforms and languages built. The radio crackled again, this time with the all clear. No immediate threat. The soldiers lowered their weapons, and the tension bled out of the room. Maria breathed out in relief and handed in the warmed formula. The cup radiated a faint heat in the frigid air, a tiny pocket of warmth in a season defined by cold. "Let's try," and whispered. She brought the cup close to the infant's lips, angling it carefully. The baby sniffed weakly, then latched onto the edge of the cloth-engulfed cup. For a moment nothing happened. Then, slowly his mouth worked. The faintest suction, the faintest swallow. The mother gasped, a soft, choke sound that held equal parts disbelief and gratitude. Her trembling hand reached out and steadied the cup alongside Anne's. Tears welled, not from drama, but from a surge of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Relief that her child might have one more day. Relief that she wasn't completely powerless after all. Outside, civilians began creeping from their hiding places. Thin figures in ragged coats, faces gray with dust and hunger. They watched from a distance, unsure whether to approach. They didn't know yet if these Americans would help them or pass them by. They had heard rumors of kindness, just as they had heard rumors of cruelty. But seeing an American nurse feed a German infant cracked something inside them, some old fear, some propaganda-taught suspicion. One elderly man leaned on his cane, whispering to no one in particular, "They are helping her." His voice carried a mix of surprise and something dangerously close to hope. A young girl with tangled hair clutched her younger brother's hand, her eyes fixed on the scene in the doorway. For the first time in months, she wasn't looking at soldiers. She was looking at saviors. The moment grew heavier than the ruins around them. It wasn't just about milk anymore. It was about the possibility that all this suffering had not erased humanity on either side. The war had turned neighbors into enemies and mothers into beggars. But now, in a broken house in a forgotten town, the simple act of mixing milk and warm water became a rebellion against everything war tried to destroy. As the baby drank and looked at his small face and wondered how many others weren't as lucky. How many infants had starved quietly in dark rooms, their cries unheard? How many mothers had endured the slow, invisible violence of hunger until their bodies gave out? She knew the records would never capture the full truth. History books would speak of battles won and surrendered cities. But no ledger would list the number of milkless mothers or the infants who slipped away before aid arrived. The baby's drinking slowed. His eyelids drooped slightly, exhaustion overtaking hunger for the moment. The mother stroked his cheek, her fingers trembling but finally steady enough to soothe him, and felt a swell of something deep, relief, resolve, maybe even defiance. But just as the infant drifted toward sleep, a distant explosion rolled across the horizon, shaking loose dust from the fractured ceiling. The war, relentless as ever, reminded them it was not finished. And neither, and realized, was the danger waiting beyond these ruined walls. The distant explosion rolled across the broken rooftops like a reminder that mercy existed only in the cracks between danger. Dust drifted from the ceiling in thin gray veils, settling over Maria, the mother, and the infant as if the war itself were trying to reclaim the room, and steadied the mother with one hand and held the cup firmly with the other. The baby had drunk enough for the moment, and now he rested against his mother's chest, eyelids fluttering with exhaustion. He wasn't saved, not yet, but he was no longer losing the battle minute by minute. That alone felt like a tiny revolt against the wider collapse outside. Corporal Lewis stepped back into the doorway, his rifle lowered but still ready. "Artillery, not close," he said quietly. "We're clear for now." His eyes lingered on the baby, and something in his posture shifted, a stiffness melting. Soldiers were trained to focus on threats, but witnessing a starving child breathing more steadily had a way of rearranging priorities, even for men who had seen too much. Maria knelt beside the mother, offering her a small tin of rations. The young woman hesitated, glancing from the tin to and unsure whether she was allowed to accept such a thing from the people she'd been told were invaders. "Bit," Maria urged softly. "Please." The mother nodded, but instead of eating first, she tore off a small piece and touched it to the baby's lips, instinctively choosing him over herself, and gently stopped her. "For you," she said. "He needs you strong." The woman blinked, stunned by the logic. In a world where strength had been demanded of her long after she had run out of it, the idea felt almost foreign. Outside, the wind carried the faint sounds of other civilians stepping out from hiding, shuffling feet, hushed whispers, the low clatter of someone shifting debris to create a path through the ruins. A small cluster gathered several yards away, watching with cautious eyes. They didn't dare approach, but the sight before them, a German mother receiving help from American nurses, unwound some of the fear that had been tightened inside them for years. Propaganda posters had warned of enemies who would show no mercy. Yet here mercy was in simple, undeniable form. The infant stirred again, letting out a weak cry, the kind that came more from hunger's memory than hunger's current grip, and tested the formula's temperature once more, then brought the cup close. The baby latched with slightly more strength this time. Even that small improvement made the mother's breath hitch. Her hands fluttered, unsure where to rest. On the cup, on her child, on her own heart still racing with fear and fragile hope. Maria glanced at Anne. "He's fighting," she whispered. "He wants to live," and nodded, but she didn't allow herself too much relief. Infants were unpredictable in starvation. One hour they fought, the next they faded. But for now, this child was choosing life with every small swallow. One of the soldiers, Private Hardin, stepped forward awkwardly, scratching at the back of his neck. "Ma'am, I have extra powdered milk in my pack. My sister sent some." He didn't quite meet anyone's eyes as he said it. It's not regulation to hand over personal supplies, but he looked at the infant again, and the unfinished sentence said everything, and allowed a faint smile. Hardin had been tough, closed off, and stubborn during most of their journey. But war had a way of cracking even the hardest shells when confronted with something as simple as a hungry baby. He pulled the small tin from his pack and placed it near the mother, who stared at it as though afraid it might vanish. "For das Baby," he said awkwardly in broken German. "For the baby." The woman's eyes filled, and she managed a trembling "Danke." Hardin pretended not to hear, suddenly very interested in adjusting his rifle strap. More civilians crept closer now, emboldened by the sight of soldiers offering help rather than harm. An elderly woman with a scarf tied tightly around her hair pressed a hand to her chest. A teenage boy, lanky and wide-eyed, whispered to his younger sister in awe. The line between enemy and rescuer blurred until it barely existed. Here, in this ruined street, they all looked more alike than different, thin, tired, frightened, and desperate for normalcy. The mother's breathing steadied as she watched her child. For the first time, her shoulders lowered from their defensive hunch. She reached up, gripping Anne's sleeve lightly, a gesture that carried deep gratitude and deeper vulnerability, and placed her other hand over the mother's, grounding her in the present. "We should take them to the aid station," Maria said quietly. "They won't survive another night in these conditions." Louis nodded. "We'll escort." The mother looked confused until and explained slowly. "We take you. Warm place. Food. Safe." The woman's eyes widened, torn between fear and hope. Her gaze darted to the other civilians, as if asking their permission. The older woman nodded encouragingly, and the mother sagged with relief, and helped her to her feet, supporting her frail frame. The baby clung to her, calmer now, as if sensing the sudden shift, a doorway opening into something less cruel. The small procession formed quickly, nurses guiding, soldiers surrounding, the mother holding her child as if cradling the last fragment of her world. As they stepped out into the open street, the civilians parted like a quiet sea, watching this fragile parade of mercy unfold. A boy no older than 10 stepped forward timidly. "Will she be safe?" he asked, and paused, meeting his anxious eyes. "Yes," she assured him softly. "Safe." The boy let out a breath he'd been holding for far too long. They began to move down the street, the wind colder now, the ruins casting long shadows across their path. The mother stumbled once, but Maria caught her. The infant slept against her shoulder, his tiny breaths warm against her skin, proof that life still clung where war tried to take. As they rounded a corner, the aid station came into view, an American tent pitched beside the wreck of an old town hall. Smoke curled from a makeshift stove inside. Warmth, food, blankets, possibilities the mother hadn't dared imagine that morning. She tightened her grip on her child and stepped forward. But before they reached the tent, Louis slowed, eyes narrowing. Fresh boot prints, German, not American, crossed the street in front of them, heading toward the outskirts. Recently made. Very recently. He raised a hand, signaling the column to halt. Mercy was fragile, he realized. And someone had just stepped through this area before them. Something that might not welcome what they were doing. For a long moment, no one moved. The fresh boot prints etched across the frost were a reminder that even the smallest mercy had to survive the shadow of danger. But Louis lowered his rifle slightly after a tense scan of the ruined street. Whoever had passed through was gone now, swallowed by the wider wasteland the war had carved across Germany. With a cautious nod, he motioned the group forward, and they resumed their slow walk toward the aid station. Yet something had shifted, not just in the soldier's posture, but in the air itself. The mother sensed it too. She tightened her hold on her child, her steps unsteady but determined. Every inch closer to the tent felt like a victory, a stolen moment of safety in a landscape that had forgotten the meaning of such things. Inside the American aid station, the warmth wrapped around them like a heavy blanket the moment the flap closed behind them. It wasn't much, just a stove, a table with medical supplies, and a row of cots. But compared to the cold ruins outside, it felt like another world. The mother blinked against the sudden shift in temperature, her breath trembling out of her as the heat touched her skin. The infant stirred in her arms, whimpering, confused by the abrupt comfort, and guided her to a cot near the stove, lowering her gently onto it. "Rest," she said. "You're safe here." The woman didn't speak, but the way she exhaled, slow, shaking, disbelieving, was all the confirmation needed. Maria moved quickly, fetching blankets and ration biscuits, softened in warm water. The mother accepted them with both hands, though her fingers shook so badly she nearly dropped the bowl, and steadied it, her touch soft but firm. "Eat slowly," she warned. "Your body needs time." The woman nodded and took a small bite, her eyes widening as if she'd forgotten what food tasted like. Distance faster than leaflets dropped from the sky, and it changed the way people looked at uniforms, both theirs and the ones they had been taught to trust. The mother finished her small portion of food, then pulled her infant close, pressing her cheek to his. Tears slid silently down her face. They weren't dramatic, and they weren't loud. They were the kind that came from finally, painfully realizing that survival might be possible after all, and sat beside her, listening to the mother's soft breaths. For a moment, the world outside, the bombs, the boots, the hunger, the politics, faded. You saved him, the woman whispered in German, her voice cracking, and shook her head gently. No, you carried him through the worst. We only helped. The mother looked unconvinced. Perhaps she always would. Some gratitude was too heavy to put into words. Maria approached with a clean cloth, wiping the infant's face. He's a strong little guy, she said quietly. The mother smiled faintly, an expression so delicate it seemed it might shatter. He should have had milk, she murmured. He should have had a home, and exchanged a glance with Maria. There was nothing to say to that. War had taken too much from too many. Yet in this small corner of the wreckage, something new was taking shape. It wasn't victory or surrender or strategy. It was trust, not the loud kind that governments declared, but the quiet kind built one life-saving gesture at a time. A nurse feeding an enemy's child, a soldier sharing his family's powdered milk, a mother stepping into an American aid station without fear. These were tiny threads in a shattered tapestry, but they were strong, stronger, perhaps, than the hatred that had fueled the war. As the mother rested at last, drifting into an exhausted sleep, and stood and moved to the tent entrance. She lifted the flap slightly. She wasn't the only one. All across occupied Germany, millions were relearning that hunger could fade, even briefly. The baby, wrapped now in a clean American blanket, let out a softer sound, a tired sigh rather than a cry, and watched him closely, noting the improved color in his cheeks. It wasn't brilliance. He still looked fragile enough to break under the weight of the world. But he was no longer fading. He was fighting, and that small difference felt monumental. Lewis and Hardin lingered near the tent entrance, speaking in low tones. Their job wasn't done just because one mother and child had been helped. The war still pressed in on every side, unpredictable and unforgiving. But both men kept glancing back at the cot, as if reminding themselves why they stood guard. Hardin cleared his throat once, then muttered, "Kid looks better." Lewis only nodded, though his expression softened in a way he would never admit aloud. Outside, the murmur of civilians gathering near the tent filtered through the canvas. Timid voices, cautious footsteps, hope pushing them closer despite fear. The sight of one family being helped had loosened something in them, something propaganda and desperation had tightened for years. They weren't rushing the Americans, but they were watching closely, waiting to see if this single act was an exception or the truth, and knew the weight of their eyes. She knew how moments like this spread, how they became stories whispered between neighbors, between families, between survivors. The Americans helped her. They fed the baby. They weren't what we were told. Stories like that traveled farther than artillery ever could. They melted, peering out at the civilians who still waited at a distance. Their faces were thin, wary, expectant. She wondered how many were mothers like the woman inside. How many infants had cried, with no one left strong enough to answer. How many grandparents had starved, so the young might eat first. Hunger had woven itself into the soul of the country, quiet but relentless. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke. Enemy or ally, it no longer mattered. War still lingered. But inside the tent, a different truth had bloomed. A truth that history often tucked between footnotes and official statements. The truth that mercy was not confined to nations. It belonged to individuals, the ones who chose it despite fear, exhaustion, and orders that never mentioned kindness. And lowered the flap and turned back to the sleeping mother and child. Maria tucked the blanket more securely around them. Hardin cleared his throat again, pretending he wasn't staring. Lewis scanned the street with renewed vigilance. And just when peace seemed to settle, however briefly, the radio crackled once more. A new message, urgent in tone, cut through the tent. It reminded them all that this moment, this fragile, human miracle, was only the beginning of what the day would demand. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.